Hi, and welcome to Gamers exPlane, a channel dedicated to tabletop role-playing, and in particular, play-by-post, using gamersplane.com. In the segment Player versus Player, we interview users from Gamersplane in order to find out how people use the service and engage in play-by-post gaming. Hopefully, we'll learn from each other and improve our own games, and maybe have a little fun along the way. In today's episode, in Player versus Player, I interview a user named SkepticalStun, and we will discuss whatever we want. Following the interview, there will be a meme of the week, QQ&AA, my own version of viewer mail, and then Qralloqian lore, a short tip and trick to using gamersplane.com. I'm Qralloq, and this is Gamers exPlane. Hi, and welcome to Gamers exPlane. This is Qralloq, and I have with me
Yeah, sounds good.
Today, SkepticalStun is a fairly new user. He joined about a year ago, I think, Gamersplane. And could you tell me a little bit about yourself, like how long you've been playing role-playing games, and how did you find Gamersplane?
Yeah, it was about a year ago. It really has been a year. Finding it, I'm not gonna lie to you, I think it was through Reddit, but I can't remember how I stumbled upon the idea of play-by-post to begin with. I know there was something related to COVID. Once COVID started to really come down, about March or April in the United States, my kids ended up, their daycare closed down, obviously, for obvious reasons. And my work schedule, thankfully, I still got paid the same, but I was only working 1 out of every 3 days. So I think it was like 2 days off and 1 day on, sort of thing. So I ended up taking care of the kids all day, which is fine, but there's only so much you can do with a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old and stay mentally sane. Like, I love spending time with them, but they don't stimulate the adult mind quite the way that other adults would. And I ended up being kind of bored and kind of, I'm still part of like the D&D subreddits, the RPG subreddits, because it's my really only social media outlet. And I think somebody linked me to Gamersplane in a few other places, and after kind of stumbling around a few other options, I ended up at Gamersplane, which it worked out really well, actually. I joined up, I kind of poked around here and there, and for like a month, I've been really craving a Lord of the Rings, some kind of Lord of the Rings RPG. I had been playing One Ring when the COVID thing came down, and Dankel started up Adventures in Middle Earth, I think it's called. He just happened to start it up like the week that I joined. I managed to hop into that, and ended up being a good game. We ended up continuing that for about a year before, for one reason or another, I ended up having to hop out of that one.
Yeah, Lord of the Rings, great. I've the One Ring is one game that I've had on my wish list and have never got to play yet. So, no, Adventures in Middle Earth is the 5th edition.
That's funny. I've actually still got I got a little Lego minifig in my office.
So, COVID. Do you think if you hadn't have been stuck at home, would you have reached out for some kind of online gameplay?
It's really hard to say. It was kind of a weird time for me. I did have ostensibly a group. I've only been in RPGs, like tabletop stuff, honestly, since like 2018. It hasn't really been that long. It's something I've been on the proximity of, on the edge of, but I've never really taken the leap in. And I hopped in with a group in 2018, and then the main DM, like the forever DM guy, ended up having to move up north, and the whole thing just kind of dissolved. And a couple of us kind of came together, but it wasn't really working out. And I had started to DM like a one-shot for them, and then COVID happened. It just wasn't scratching that itch. There was something about it that it just didn't seem right. It felt forced. It felt strained. And Gamersplane has definitely, it's helped a lot with the role play aspect of it, which is something that I've still have not found a good online group for. Like we'll role play a little bit, but it feels kind of awkward and forced, and it just never really works. So this is the first time I've actually found a group where we can actually role play, and like it works better than it has in any other medium I've found. It's less awkward. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, for sure. Like when you, I know a lot of people when they play D&D in particular, but other games as well, it's more like a really advanced tactical board game. You know, you have objectives, you have strategies, you go through it. A lot of table talk about what you're going to do, attacking the situation, resolving problems, solving puzzles, what have you. But it isn't necessarily about taking on a personality and seeing what that personality will do in those circumstances, which is probably the heart of role play and the real strength of play by post.
Yeah, it's that, and for a lot of people, especially in this hobby, as a stereotype, it's hard to say because I don't want to offend anybody, but like personally, I find that I struggle trying to inhabit the mind of someone else and then play that out in front of strangers. Like you're doing improv in front of strangers. And I've always had, I think a lot of people, especially in this sort of hobby, have always sort of had issues with anxiety and social situations. We get a lot of introverts in this hobby, and trying to pretend to be someone else, especially in a fantasy setting. Yeah, I mean, it gets to be really difficult. I can't do it. I end up having to like have a couple of drinks, and it has to be a group that I trust. There's no way I could do that in front of people on Roll20 or people like strangers off of Reddit. I have trouble doing it in front of friends, let alone complete strangers. You know what I mean?
Yep. Yeah, I used to belong to this Facebook Roll20 tabletop one-shot group. It's basically just a Facebook group where people would post one-shot games, grab a few players, throw them all together, and just for 3 or 4 hours do a one-shot. And the few times I've been role playing since 1981. Like it's not my first kick around the block, and I find it really difficult to truly role play in front of people you've never met before. You know?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's a sense of letting your guard down, and it's something I've really struggled with. I've tried to play games with people from work. I've played games with like spin-off groups with strangers. I've played games with friends, and that sense of letting your guard down to try to, it's embarrassing. Let's be honest. Like it's hard to do without trying to be embarrassed unless you're a trained actor or something like that. Really let go and be that other person. It's really hard to do. And I feel like PvP is easier. It's an entirely different set of skills, because at that point you're writing, you're not acting anymore. And a good actor is not the same as a good writer. I'm not a good actor, but for some reason writing seems to come easier to me.
Now, have you practiced any creative writing, written stories at all, or naughty limericks?
No, that's the really odd part. Is I honestly, the only feedback I've gotten from a good writer is like, God, this sounds dumb, but like emailing. I did a lot of traveling in my past. I've been all over North America, all over Central America for work and for other reasons. And I'd like send emails back to my family telling them like, oh, we went to this city today, we did this thing, so on and so forth. And I get compliments, and I'm like, oh man, I really like your writing, building them right there. I really like, I appreciate you sending these to me. I really look forward to these. And it's kind of stuck in the back of my head, like, oh, maybe I am a good writer. I never saw that coming. And I sort of hopped into it with PvP. I've never done creative writing before last year. And it's really, I've enjoyed it far more than I expected to.
Yeah, well, that's cool. I've written 4 novels. I've only published one, self-published, and a whack of short stories I've been writing all my life, and I find it quite rewarding. So I would encourage you to look to keep doing that. Now, play by
Yeah,
post is a
it's
great medium for that.
yeah. The idea of writing something it's intimidating. You guys have my admiration for being able to do something like that. Like being able to write consistently is not an easy thing to do, and I find that like my original posting schedule was multiple times a day. And since work picked up after the whole COVID thing washed out, it or begun to wash out, it's picked up, and my posting schedule dropped to once a day and less than once a day. And the other day after work and kids and everything else, it's hard to force creative energy out, if that makes any sense. And the idea of being able to write, especially you, I know you're writing what, like 8, 9, 10, a dozen games every day. I don't know how you guys do that. It's impressive and a little intimidating that you're able to continue doing it with a high degree of success and quality.
Well, that's debatable. Quantity isn't quality, but yeah, and I do probably average, I would guess, 30 posts a day. But that's not day one. I'm 6 years into being a member of GamersPlane, and I've scaled up and scaled down my games, and it's like any skill, with practice it becomes easier. And literally, that's um, I've got a user scheduled for another interview who's a perfect example of that, and just starting off being a very slow poster, and with practice becoming a much more rapid poster, being able to switch back and forth between games. And yeah, but it is practice. And
Oh yeah, I'm sure practice definitely helps. I mean, you get to that point where like there are definitely times where I'm looking at I hop on at work and I read a couple posts here and there, and I'm thinking like, oh, I've got 3 minutes. That's not enough time for me to put something together. Partially because it's hard to concentrate. Like I'm being interrupted by stuff at work, or like the kids are demanding my attention as they should. Or I've got like laundry to do, dishes to do, like I gotta make dinner, that sort of thing. So by 9 o'clock, I've got like half an hour of possible time, so I can like try to pound something through them. It'll be good to. It does feel easier now than it did last year.
yeah, well, you just walked right into one of my questions and half answered it, which is, I find GamersPlane is very quiet on weekends, just suspiciously quiet, and it leads me to believe that a lot of people post only on their work computers. And so on the weekends, they're home and they're not posting because they're not at work. But it seems like you're a part of this crowd where maybe you would post at work if you had more spare time, but largely your posting's done at night at home.
More work I used to. So I'm in the U.S. military. I'm in the Coast Guard. At the moment, I'm an aviation mechanic. Before, when I first got into GamersPlane, I was transitioning from literally turning wrenches on a helicopter that I work on into what's called a field terminal operator, essentially doing paperwork and logistics and that sort of thing. It meant that in my spare time, I could my phone and then copy and paste that into the account and Gamers playing, because the firewalls prevent getting a Gamers playing at all. These days I'm back into turning wrenches again. I can't get on the Gamers playing during the day at all.
Yeah.
So pretty much like I've got from like 2 to 4 in the afternoon, and then again from like 9 o'clock to 10. And like those are my free hours when that's whether it's going to the gym or trying to find some personal time reading a book, like that's all the personal time I get during the day. So I'm trying to kind of squeeze things in here and there. And I wish I could see like a line graph or something from the number of posts that I've gone from last year to the number I've got now. I'm sure it's just dropped through the floor. I'm hoping that in the next year or two, it'll pick back up again because I'm getting back in more of the desk jobs here.
Cool. Yeah, I worked as a defense contractor for a number of years on an Air Force base. So a lot of my friends were aviation mechanics, fighter jets rather than helicopters, but you know, very similar.
Yeah, I mean, the same idea, same general set of ideas. Unfortunately, it doesn't give you a lot of like alone time to come up with a creative post of what would happen in this scenario with somebody that's not you. Because the entire time, even if you're just on your phone, you're having people talk to you, you're having people come in. It's disruptive, to say the least. It's not conducive to creative writing.
Yeah. So when you're putting together a game, like you joined my Numenera game, and your character Emmett has just been great. Your posts are long and detailed, full of character and motivation and an explanation. And so, what do you use for inspiration when you come up with somebody like Emmett?
Oh heck, I honestly, I wish I had a method. There's not really a method to it. It's just sort of like I think of which character would be cool to me. Like is what would be fun and interesting. What kind of interesting flaws? What kind of like weird past do they have? So, for instance, Emmett had like he's this lawman because you would mention in your game at one point that I don't remember how I got the idea that it was supposed to be a Western, but I did. And I've always wanted to play this like lawman ideal. But I also threw in some of the sort of like dark past. Have you ever watched the anime Cowboy Bebop?
I watched the first episode. I don't think anything more.
Well, first of all, you're absolutely missing out. It's fantastic. But there's two characters in there. One named Jet who has like a machinery left arm that he uses for a lot of things, and the other one, Spike, has this past, which is this war that occasionally gets alluded to. Between that and like Malcolm Reynolds from Firefly, they both got this sort of past in a war that they're not proud of, they're not happy about, they're trying to just move past it. And they end up doing this completely separate thing. It was sort of a combination of pop culture references. Now I think about it, a lot of my characters end up being sort of that same thing. Except for I'm playing this one monk in a D&D game with that Adam is DMing, named Grummond, and he was entirely built off just a cool avatar picture I found on the internet. Like it started with the picture and kind of spun out from there.
In real life games, I often start with a funny accent, and I never really role play the accent, but it's in my head, and then a lot of the character spins out of that. You just need an anchor, I think, and something to really connect you to the character.
Oh man, I'm sure that Adam is absolutely sick of my writing with Grummond. He was supposed to be like a Scottish dock worker or something like that, and it's just like depending on how tired or creative I feel, like sometimes I'm like, yeah, I'm totally channeling this dude, and another time I'm just not. And it's absolutely ridiculous. It's not consistent at all. It's just sort of whatever he was originally supposed to be, this vulgar cursing dock worker like esque. He was a pit fighter, former sailor. So of course he's supposed to be gruff. He's supposed to be half drunken. But again, it's if I'm not feeling it that day, how do you channel that creativity? How do you make that happen? Like, oh man, I'm on like 6 hours of sleep. I can't do it today. I'm just gonna throw something together. Come on, sweetie. Hang on just a second. You want to say goodnight? Let me kiss.
Thank you.
Well, she's the cutest thing ever.
Say again?
I said she's the cutest thing ever.
I appreciate it. I had the idea that she was going to end up coming in here at some point in time, and I was like, oh, I want to. Does she want to be on YouTube? Sure, why not? Screw it.
Yeah, so when Adam joined GamersPlane, he joined my D&D game at the time, and he created this dwarf named Mavis, and she had this thick Scottish Baroque, and he would type that out, right? And it was just gibberish. Half the time I'd just be laughing, and I'm like, I'm going to need a translation. It was just awesome. Okay, so here's a question.
Honestly, I'm kind of torn. Like it's really hard. It's really hard to write an accent, and it's something that, like, even when I've looked at creative writing advice, one of the things people say is like it's 50-50. Don't write an accent, and the other half says like, oh yeah, totally go into it. It's great. And I can't quite decide what the right thing to do. Like you can impart a personality without having to write the accent, but it's a lot harder writing the accent because then you actually have to like I'm not from Scotland, obviously. So how do you come up with that accent? You have to do some research, have to get yourself into it. It's tough. It's a lot harder than I expected it to be.
Yeah, and I think one of the tricks is to use it sparingly, establish the voice in a few phrases here and there, but other than that, just write normally. So the reader gets used to reading with your accent, and so your regular text, which doesn't have any of the slang or the weird, quadruple R's in a row, they'll just read that as part of the way they read.
Yeah, that's another thing I was reading was like you kind of find one or two or three things and you kind of lean into them. Like one of the things he does is I know he curses. There's certain words he uses a lot when he curses. There's certain slang words he uses a lot. He doesn't finish words. Emmett does the same thing. He doesn't finish a word in ing. It's always in apostrophe because they're sort of lazy speaking. That's how they. For Emmett, it's like a southern drawl. For Drummond, it's sort of a Scottish sort of slur. It's just sort of finding those couple of things where this is how they talk and lean into those particular things. Like those three things are his sort of anchor. And beyond that, I can branch out. Sometimes he'll do one thing or another, but I can always come back to those few things. That, and I found the Scottish slang dictionary on the internet with some really creative cursing, a lot of which I can't use on GamersPlane. It's a little rude even for me.
Yeah. Yeah. So here's another random question for you. Do you watch sports?
Ooh, that is a random question. It depends. If I have the free time, I would. I was brought up in Tampa Bay, Florida, so like the Bucks were my NFL team. I don't ever watch the NFL. I don't have time. We were cord cutters years ago, so I don't have any way of watching the NFL anymore. And like I wish I could get into rugby. It's harder than you'd expect in America to be able to get into rugby in the first place. So in general, no, I don't tend to watch sports.
But you would. You're something of a fan. You just don't have the access.
Yeah, I mean, I'm especially a fan when they're going to go like winning Super Bowls, which for the Bucks is big. That's a big deal. We don't do things like win Super Bowls except once in like 2003.
Yeah, so the reason I ask is I've got this theory that role players and sports fans are two disconnecting circles in a Venn diagram. Like these are just separate groups. And now I watch sports when I can, and I've played sports. I've played rugby for most of the 90s. And, I enjoy hockey and tennis, and I watch a lot of football mostly these days. But none of my gaming friends do. They just don't understand sports. And it's just a weird disconnect. So.
If you would, I don't think you could name two hobbies that had less to do with each other. It's not the people, although I mean, if you're going to talk stereotypes, you have people that play RPGs and people that are really into sports. And you're right, those circles don't touch.
Yeah.
They don't tend to have a lot in common with each other. But it's the type of people are completely different. Like if you're talking major authors or people that inhabit a character on a stage versus like sportscasters and people who play a lot of sports, the idea of getting into someone's head, not because of what they're doing, but why. I feel like you'd have more in common with journalists than you would people who are, or I don't know, sports journalists who are really interested in like the numbers and how somebody performed that week. They're more into sort of the crunch of it, if you want to get into RPG terms.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting.
It's an interesting theory.
Yeah. It's an observation looking for a theory, but I think yours is a good one. Yeah. So another question I'd like to ask is, if you're imagining what would be your best role-playing experience, your dream game, what do you think that would be? Would you be a player or a GM? And would you be a player or a GM? And what would the game type be? And what do you think the game would look like?
Like my optimal situation. It's funny you ask that. Right now I'm chomping at the bit trying to GM something. I sent you a message earlier today. I sent a few other people a message, essentially like reserving a spot here in like a month, saying like, I want to start this game. Like I've never done it before, not on PvP. I've DM'd a little bit here and there in person, but I find it exhausting trying to do this in front of people, trying to keep all those plates in the air. But I feel like in play by post, it'd be a lot easier to handle, at least for a first time. And if you were to ask me right now, I'd say I'd much rather GM a game. If you were to ask me a year ago, I'd much rather be a player. Like I'm kind of flip-flopping between the two. Like you strike me more as a person that would rather run a game than play in one. Like you can always sort of tell the people who would rather run things and sort of pilot the ship, pilot the aircraft rather than just be a passenger.
Yeah, no, and that's true. I'm one of those forever GM types by choice. No, I'm playing in a lot more games than I'm running, and I'm really trying to explore being a player more than I do in real life, because where I'm almost always the GM, and I just love the creative outlet. Just love it. Recommend it. Jump into it. Go hard. You'll have a ton of support. Play by post gives you the opportunity, if you're not sure what to do, you can punt or do like I do. Roll initiative. Then gives you 2 or 3 days to figure out what happens next. No, you seriously have a ton of time, right? You can just hit pause. Just
It's funny. It was coming up today in Discord. Sorry, I mean, if it isn't obvious to the viewers already, we're kind of a weird delay, but yeah, it came up today in Discord. They were talking about GM stuff, and I was giving my input. I thought about it a little bit after. I'm like, I have no idea what I'm talking about. I'm literally just spouting what I would do if I were in that position, but I'm by no means like an experienced GM. It is a hard job to do, especially in 5e. 5e really doesn't make it easy on people running the game. Since you introduced me to Numenera and the Cypher system, if I ever go back to gaming in person, it's probably going to be the Cypher system. It's so much easier to do. It's hard enough trying to imagine like what the next stuff out there, and it'll generally come together. But 5e is a million different things going on all at the same time, especially once you get into combat. Like, you're expected to narrate well, you're expected to keep track of everything well, and it's really difficult to do, and it's kind of intimidating as a first-time GM to do it.
yeah, I can see that. Like this last combat you guys had in Numenera was a bunch of these 5-legged, 2 scorpion-tailed aliens, and I'm like, well, there's like 10 of them in a box and they attack you. Now, so these things don't exist, right? This is a creature I've made up. And here's their stats. Their difficulty 2. That's it. That's all I need to know. Difficulty 2. And I gave them like 2 hit points, which rather than 6, which a difficulty 2 would imply. So the Cypher system just makes everything super easy as a baseline. And then the whole system is stripped way down. So you don't have a lot of the tactical choices you do in D&D, and that's a big strength of D&D's. You could play it as a intense tactical board game, and it's pretty robust for that. But it is a lot of work, because then as the GM, you have to know all of the options the players have available. You have to give them chances to make that, to use those options, and so they can shine. And that's just something you need to remind yourself of and do.
I mean, do you find that you have a preference on system that you run?
That's a great question. When I discovered Numenera, which was on GamersPlane, I've learned so much from there. It quickly became my favorite system, especially the Strange, which I should run more. The Strange is kind of a modern version of Numenera, like modern day Earth, except it involves universe jumping. So like you can quantum leap from Earth to a world where it's all fantasy, or a world where it's all cyberpunk, or ancient past, or whatever you have. And it just works so well for PvP because it's so simple, it's straightforward, and yet it has some depth. My favorite system of all time has got to be Feng Shui, which is a cinematic Hong Kong action movie role-playing. Basically, all the characters start off being like James Bond, or an Arnold Schwarzenegger character, or Jet Li, or just world beaters, top of the game. And you get involved in a system that really allows that level of competence to shine. So it's just a lot of fun.
It's interesting. There are certain systems I feel like would shine better in place than others would. And honestly, as popular as 5e is, it's not one of them. I love 5e. I really enjoy it. It's by far the most popular system out there. But for play by post, it just doesn't. It's not perfect. It requires a lot of input. It requires a lot of step by step. And God help you if you get stuck in a dungeon, because I've never had a dungeon crawl that worked in play by post. It's just there's only so much you can do by like, okay, here's this room. Oh, it's a fight. Okay, you won the fight after a week of effort. Okay, here's the next room. Oh, it's a trap. You took some damage. Here's the next room. It's another fight. So that's like a week of effort. And it's not like interesting fights. It's like, okay, here's a 10 by 10 room. Get to work. And I imagine like Cypher system, there's more to be done with it. A lot of the OSR systems, there's more interesting things you can do, which is a real bummer because I love the crunch. I'd love to get in the Pathfinder. I really enjoy 5e for the sort of tactical battle simulator that it could be if you're in person instead of like 1 or 2 actions a day. But that's just not what we're dealing with. And it's interesting to try to figure out how to make this work. That's my main challenge in this last year. How do I make this work for what play by post is? Not what it could be, not what I wish it was, but what it actually is.
Yeah, dungeons can be done. I'm in a Pathfinder game, Curse of the Crimson Throne, run by Dark Raider. And we finished the first book of that adventure path. So that's 3 or 4 levels. There's 6 books to the entire path. And there was 2 or 3 dungeon crawls in there, and he made it work. It was, I think he puts a lot of effort in though, behind the scenes, putting a map together, describing things, using the fog of war to limit what we can see really well. And they were fairly interesting dungeons. One was a crypt filled with Durgar and necromancers rather than just, kobolds. But you're right. I've
seen some examples of good dungeons, bad dungeons, and I feel like the ones that really would work are like the mega dungeons you would see in pre-written modules, where you've got a long hallway and then a room and then another hallway and a room and then another room and then a hallway, then another hallway. Like it doesn't work that way. Whereas if you had sort of set pieces stacked up against another, oh, in this room you've got this pit with a big thing of lava in it, and there's some people in a cage over the top, and you got to figure out like how to get them out of there. And the next room is like, oh, there's a waterfall, but it looks like might be something behind it. Maybe there's a secret passage. Like every time there might be something different with a set of decisions. But if you're just wandering through darkened hallways, like it fits more the old school D&D theme and the old school style, but it doesn't really work for what we have to do. And in the cases that I've seen, which are admittedly limited, I've only been here like a year, that's when people start ghosting. That's when things really slow down. Like it gets to be kind of a drag. And even I'm guilty of it myself. Like you see, like, oh, there's been a new post. I'm like, I'll get to it like tomorrow or something. Because I know it's just going to be like, oh, it's somebody updating the fight, or it's somebody saying like, oh, what's this one brick wall mean? I don't care. I know it's not going to be anything.
Yeah, combat really does slow down a game in play by post, and it is something to be aware of, that some games are very much fighting games, and all of your character decision options are about how to be a better fighter, how to, control your enemies and maneuver them, or just flat out kill them. So it seems like games like D&D require you to put on a fighting hat more and more often than you probably like. But it's your game. It is your game. You can do whatever you want.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, I'm trying to DM something here in the next month or so. And originally, when I come up with those ideas, it was for in-person role play. Like this idea of like this desert campaign or like this sort of mercenary company campaign. And they're all sort of built around the idea of like, we'll knock out like 3 or 4 fights in a session, then we'll come back next week and do some other stuff. But if I'm going to do it for play by post, if we're talking 2 or 3 fights in a row, by the 3rd fight, people are exhausted. They want to do something different. So it really has to be designed in a different way. It's like, so I don't know how many video games you or any of the people watching this play. You can't design a video game for the computer the same way that you would for a different platform. It doesn't work the same way. It's exhausting in different ways. The same way that you can't design the same game for like a computer that you would for a board game. Like it's entirely different methods. And I think it's sort of the same thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. You can't. There's a lot of talk that World of Warcraft really influenced the design of Dungeons and Dragons 4th edition. And 4th edition became a tactical masterpiece, I really think. It's just some of the design decisions that went into it just really, really nailed it on the head. But because of that focus on tactics, a lot of people just skipped the whole thing, and Pathfinder became the most popular game in the world. Totally took over first place for sales because people just weren't interested in that level of focused excellence, I guess. I mean, it just did tactics so well.
Which is interesting to me because, I mean, for somebody that has not played Pathfinder, it's sort of when I see people talking about it, it's supposed to be, oh, it's 3.5 turned into a new system, which I always thought was the tactical thing. Like I thought it was really combat heavy. I thought it was like you required to have a grid, very rules heavy. And it started to make me realize, like, I really have no idea what was going on with the 3.5, 4.0 era for D&D. It's just weird. Like, I've read a couple of histories here and there. I read that giant years ago. They cleared it up for me, but not really. It was interesting to realize, or to learn that the people who put together Pathfinder were from D&D in the first place. It was literally a spin-off that became its own thing.
Yeah, it was a set of home. Pathfinder was a publishing company, and they wrote. Paizo wrote adventures for D&D 3.5, and when 3.5 stopped supporting, for their own home games, they had a bunch of house rules. So essentially, Pathfinder is just D&D 3.5 with these house rules. And then they polished it up a bit, play tested it extensively, just massively. And it became a very polished successor to 3.5, built entirely on the same system, but with just a few tweaks. In fact, you can use 3.5 and Pathfinder games adventures almost interchangeably. They're pretty close.
That's really interesting, and I feel like they, again, coming from, I wish I just I'm going to put an asterisk now, but I have to stop saying it as we continue. I'm new at this. I've done a lot of reading about it, but I haven't lived it the way some people have. I've been playing this since '81, which, by the way, is really impressive. I wish I could have been playing since '81, but whatever. I feel like they do a much better job of A, playtesting, and B, putting out these official adventure paths. There's a ton of them. And they do a really, really good job of giving stuff out for these people to use in their games, which, at least if you get onto the D&D Next subreddit, people equally love and hate 5e for what it is. Like, it's riddled with little issues here and there, if that's what you're willing to put up with. Like, there's certain subclasses I would never play. It's just not worth it because nobody noticed, oh, this doesn't work in this scenario. That's one thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this has been an excellent conversation. I think we could probably talk for a couple more hours. But in the interests of not punishing our watchers too much who are getting to the end of their train ride, perhaps we should call it here. And thank you very much for joining me tonight. Maybe, do you have any questions for me that you've wanted to ask?
I mean, I'm sure I'll come up with something the second I hang up this call. But mainly, what impresses me is that you're able to switch gears between one game and the next as quickly as you do. Like you're one of the most prolific posters, one of the most prolific game masters on the site. Personally, even if I go from one game to the next, one character to the next, it takes me a while to figure out, like, okay, what the heck were we even doing? Like, I gotta go back a page to like read forward and remind myself how things were being, like, what the feel of the moment was. And even then, I'll discover like my character asks a question that was answered 2 pages back because I forgot about something. Are you able to just kind of keep track of that sort of thing really well? Do you find yourself like keeping really good notes per each game, or do you have to re-reference every single time back in previous pages?
Yeah, no, I think it's mostly a good memory. A you know, maybe I'm just in the moment in the game, and so it sticks. I do forget things. I do miss things. There was one, it was in a Shadowrun game, and we were using green text for like group text messages between our characters. So Shadowrun being in the near future, year 2070, that kind of thing. So we're using a text messaging system to communicate amongst the team. And I said, like, why are we, this whole thing about the green text, like, are we stuck on that? And he's like, we've been doing this for like the last, 12 pages. I'm like, oh, really? I guess we have. But generally, with foibles like that aside, I do have to reference things, especially when it's details of names, the NPCs that we're running across, that sort of thing. Those don't stick into my mind as much as maybe the emotion of the moment.
Interesting. I mean, it's tough because fortunately, Adam's created that excellent extension for browsers for gamers playing, which you can view everything in one page and re-reference things back and forth and search the page itself. But there's no perfect way of doing it. There's no perfect way. It's not like if you got a paper book in front of you, you can just kind of flip back and forth. I do find it more difficult. It's more strenuous than just reading a novel. I mean, for some reason, a novel sticks with me. I can read a few lines of a book I read last week and kind of, it clicks back. But with this, there's so much more going on. There's more nuance to each character. I know that each character is referencing things that might have been referenced originally like 4 pages back. So it takes a lot of mental effort to keep track of all that. And honestly, you've got my admiration to do it. I'm in 4 games total, and even that feels like I'm pushing it. And some of those games are slow. Like it's hard to keep track of all that. So you guys who can do 6, 7, 8, 9, you were saying like your record was like 17 games. And I have no idea how you do all that. That's impressive.
Yeah, it's probably at about that now, and maybe running 10 or 12. Yeah. Yeah, it's again, it's a skill.
Like I said,
I built up to it. And once a game is underway, especially running it, once you've done the work, you've got the characters on a path, you've got an idea of what they're doing, you've got them on the road to whatever plot that they're following or you've laid out for them. the work is done, right? At that point, hopefully you're largely just giving them clues, you know, setting up some settings for them to interact with, some NPCs, but mostly they're doing all the work and you're responding. The initial work of setting up a game is getting them into that right spot where you can give them enough information that they can feel anchored to the world and then move you through it. And it's hard. It's really hard to get right. But once the games are moving, then they're a lot less effort. And so setting up a fifth game or a sixth game or a 12th game is a lot less effort than setting up 12 games all at once.
Honestly, it does definitely seem like the difficult part for a lot of these games is figuring out the overarching world, but that's the fun part. Like, I'm really looking forward to GMing because it seems like the kind of perfect interaction between game design and multiple systems working together and world building and characters, all of which I love. I love all that stuff. It's why I read fantasy novels and sci-fi. It's because world building and systems working together and everything's sort of talking to each other. It's why I love really complicated video games. All that stuff sort of cohesively working together, and that's really what you're aiming for as a GM. I feel like is in a homebrew world, you start out with this idea, this one small idea, and kind of build upon that. You've got, in this world, gods are all playing some giant board game. They are the D&D players. How does that affect the world? How would that also affect politics? And how would that affect the biology of the creatures in that world? And how would that affect? Well, you kind of spool out from there. And I feel like once you get all that set up over the course of, like, I don't know, a couple of months of just sort of running around inside your head, once it's together, you're done. And you just sort of let the players go nuts in that world. Like, they're going to wreck shit. You know they are. So just kind of let them mess things up as best they're gonna, and you're just there to make sense of the tangle of blood, as it were.
Yeah. All right. Well, I look forward to your GMing enterprise, and thank you again for joining me tonight, despite our technical issues, which seem okay on this end, but hopefully when I replay it later and go through it, it records as well as it looked here. But there was a bit of a lag, so I apologize to the watcher for that.
If nothing else, I was thinking about it half through the conversation. It's ironically accurate for play-by-post that you can't respond in a timely fashion with one-word answers. You have to come up with a sufficient explanation and what you're going to say ahead of time, and then continue it, because I know you're not going to be able to respond within 3 seconds as normal.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, SkepticalStun, for joining me, Qralloq, on Gamers Explain.
Have a good night. Thanks for having me.
Hi, and welcome to Gamers Explain QQ&AA, Qralloq questions and asks answers, or something like that. This is a viewer mail segment, and so I've got 2 questions. First one is from Antoine Product, who asks, how can a DM replace ghosting players or put them on hold so that the remaining players keep on with the campaign? This is a great question, and it's a perpetual one for all GMs. Back in the day, picture it, Sicily, 1921, very long time ago, we used to have this policy, we called it INI, invisible and invincible. And so when a player didn't show up for game night, you would just simply ignore the fact that there ever was that character. You just pretend they didn't, you don't reference them, you don't get them to do stuff. And the next time the player shows up, then there they are. Now, if you were always just playing in the same room, like you just never left that room, you wouldn't have to do that. You could just ignore you could go to the bathroom and come back and it's like, hey, where are you going? For 3 days. I was in the bathroom. Ooh. But if your party is moving, and so they don't, especially if you're like in the wilderness, right? You can't just like have the player disappear and then show up in like a cave somewhere, that you just finished exploring. So it was a terrible solution, but it was a solution. In play by post, you can certainly do the same thing, right? You could just ignore the character. But there's other ways you can handle it. And one of which is to establish a grace period, which is, people have busy lives. So you could say, look, if you're gone for 2 weeks, we got to move on. I'm sorry. Like, we're just if you haven't said anything, we're just going to move on without you. Now, that kind of thing is especially effective when you think of it before you actually need it. But of course, that doesn't always happen. We don't always expect the unexpected. So make those rules, make those judgments, talk it with your players. In a smaller grace period, you can NPC the PC. You can just, use your GM powers to describe what the NPC or what the former PC, now NPC does. If the player shows back up, hand over the reins, maybe give them a little bit of catch up. If they don't show up, eventually you're going to have to deal with it. You don't want to be a GM PC. Those can be a nightmare all themselves. So how do you replace that player? Well, you can check your original interest check thread if you had one. Maybe there's players that wanted to play originally and just didn't make the cut. There's a chance they're still interested. And clearly they were interested in your original premise, so it's a good place to start. You could advertise for a replacement player. Just go into the games tavern or wherever you look for such and just say, need a replacement player. People do this all the time with some success. If the PC was key, now this is not done very much, but if the PC themselves was key to the story, advertise for somebody to take over that exact character. Now, I've personally done this twice, taken over a character that was, for various reasons, abandoned by the prior player. In one case, the character was the main character and the other players were playing supporting characters, and so it was very difficult to replace them. So the GM just gave me a copy of the character sheet. I read the whole thread, got a sense of their personality, and continued on as if I'd been playing them the entire time. And the last thing you can do is phone a friend. There's users that you probably trust or have grown to at least find reliable, and ask them to help you out in the short term. You can keep a game going and until you come up with a more permanent solution, or maybe that trusted friend ends up being the solution. But what's key, and we never really say this enough, but inactivity kills a play-by-post game. If you get in the habit or build the habit for your players that nothing happens for weeks at a time, they're going to assume that when something does happen, they've got weeks to respond. Inactivity kills a play-by-post game. So whatever you do, establish a dialogue, makes no self about my 4th edition D&D game, and keep the game going, even if you're just talking with the players in and out of character format. I hope that's helpful. Windy Ridge asks, how many games are you in, Qralloq? Oh, that took a while, sorry. I'm playing in 18 games and running, I forgot. And running 14. I mean, that's a lot. That's, I don't recommend this for anybody, like not even me. Just don't be me. and I accepted a game invite today. So I guess that's going to be 19 playing. Yeah, it's not pretty some days when you. I was joking on Saturday. I posted at 10:18 in the morning, and by just before about 1 o'clock, the game tracks your most 20 recent posts and puts a little black check mark by them if you've unread them. I had games scrolling off that top 20, which means that it became very hard to find. so, and that was 2.5 hours and 20 individual games updated. Anyway, that's a downside for being in so many. So, but thanks for asking. Anyway, so keep the questions coming. Send them by PM, either in GamersPlane, or you can PM me in Discord, or you can send me a email at Qralloq@gmail.com. This is Qralloq, and this is Gamers Explain, QQ&AA. Well, thanks everybody for joining me for episode 3 of Gamers Explain. It's been a great project, and I'm looking forward to it continuing for quite some time in the future. I've got more interviews in it coming up in advance, so be sure to mash that like button and hit subscribe, and hit the little bell to get notifications and all that sort of stuff. And thank you to SkepticalStun, and of course prior to that, Len and Qralloq for joining us, and got a great lineup or interview already recorded for next week. So I hope you are enjoying Gamers Explain. I'm Qralloq. Thank you.